I was 23 years old and standing in the Caspan Basin when the pulse hit. Not in it, precisely. I was 2 kilometers east of the basin's edge, on a press transport assigned to cover the new thermal survey platforms being erected along the Sola Ridge. Junior correspondent. Nobody important. My recorder was aimed at a drilling engineer who was explaining, with considerable patience, why the survey data would take 6 months to process. I remember the light first. A low, subsonic shimmer across the rock face, like the air itself had momentarily forgotten its density. Then the engineer stopped speaking mid-sentence. Then the ground moved. It did not shake. That is the word people use because they have no better one. It folded. The substrate of the Caspan Basin, 12,000 square kilometers of Cretaceous bedrock and centuries of colonial infrastructure, simply folded inward on a frequency that nothing built by human hands had ever produced. The collapse was over in 11 minutes. 4,214,000 people were in the basin that morning. Most of them were going about the kind of morning that has no particular significance. A shift change, a school commute, a market run, a medical appointment. The basin was a city cluster of 14 districts. It had a symphony hall, 3 universities, a hospital with a dedicated pediatric trauma ward that had won a humanitarian commendation the previous year. 11 minutes. I filed the story. Every correspondent there filed the story. The Kethavar Convergence, a civilization that had, we later learned, been dormant in the outer spiral for 11,000 years before waking to find the inner systems populated with species they considered pre-viable, issued a diplomatic communiqué 48 hours later. They expressed regret for the disruption. They described the event, in their own translation, as a resonance calibration pulse, a measuring instrument. They had needed to assess the defensive architecture of frontier civilizations before committing resources to formal pacification, and Earth represented the closest available test subject. The pulse had not been intended as an offensive action. The casualties were, in their phrasing, an infrastructure externality. They filed it and moved on. Earth's formal response arrived 6 days later. We expressed deep concern. We requested a framework for future engagement. We reduced frontier patrol density by 30% and made 3 goodwill gestures that cost us nothing and communicated everything the Convergence wanted to hear. The diplomatic record from that period reads like the correspondence of a civilization that has accepted its place. I spent 2 years believing that was what it was. Then I got a call from a man named Voran Dace, who ran a materials laboratory in the northern research district of Heron Station, and who told me, very quietly, that I should come see what they had built. The resonance signature of a calibration pulse is not difficult to isolate. The Convergence's instrument had broadcast it at a frequency that was, for them, industrial, the same band they used to test geological stability before committing to orbital extraction. It was the equivalent of tapping a wall with a knuckle. What Voran's team had spent 7 years doing, working on a budget that did not officially exist, and inside a facility that did not appear on any public register, was learning to tap back. Not at one knuckle, at scale. The problem with replicating a resonance weapon is not the frequency itself. The problem is the array architecture required to sustain it across a meaningful target volume. The Convergence's original instrument had been a dedicated platform, singular and purpose-built over generations. What humanity built, in 17 years and in silence, was different. We did not build one instrument. We built 1,140 warships each, carrying a resonance array module tuned to the exact frequency of the Caspan pulse. And we tuned them so that when fired in coordinated sequence, their combined output would not calibrate. It would answer. I was given a bunk aboard INS Callaway's weight and embedded credentials that made me, on paper, a communications systems analyst. Nobody on the ship's crew treated me as one. They knew what I was and why I was there. I had been in the basin. That was sufficient credential in the returned measure. The fleet took 3 weeks to reach Kethavar Prime. I spent most of it in the resonance module bay, which was not strictly my business, but the chief array officer, a quiet woman named Sola Heron who had lost her brother in Caspan District 7, had no objection to my presence. She was calibrating outputs for the 3rd time that week. Not from anxiety, from discipline. She wanted the numbers exact. She told me once, between adjustments, that the Convergence's original pulse had been rated at a yield sufficient to collapse a volume of approximately 12,000 square kilometers of consolidated substrate. The returned measure's combined array output was rated at a yield sufficient to collapse a volume of approximately 41,000 square kilometers of consolidated substrate. She told me this the way an engineer tells you a structural load rating, without affect, without pleasure, as if the disproportion were simply a specification, which it was. The Kethavar Convergence had 11 installations in and around their primary system, 3 orbital processing stations, 2 shipyard complexes, 4 administrative hubs distributed across the inner belt, and their residential infrastructure on Kethavar Prime itself, which supported a population of 700 million in the basin city clusters that ringed their equatorial zone. Basin cities. The irony was not lost on anyone aboard Callaway's Wait, and no one mentioned it. We arrived at the outer system boundary at 0400 hours, ship time, on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I had been keeping a log, the way correspondents do, and the date sat at the top of the entry I never finished. Convergence deep-range sensors would have registered us approximately 90 minutes earlier. At 0530, the Convergence broadcast a hail on diplomatic frequency. They identified the fleet by classification. They had records, of course, and requested our purpose and authority under Outer Spiral Transit Accord, Article 14, which governs unauthorized approach to sovereign territorial boundaries. Admiral Nen Solis, commanding Callaway's Wait and the returned measure as a whole, responded once. She read the casualty figure, 4,214,000. She read it at the pace of someone who has been holding it in their mouth for 17 years and is finally setting it down somewhere permanent. Then she read the Convergence's own phrase back to them, resonance calibration pulse, infrastructure externality. Then she said the returned measure was activating pursuant to Earth Defense Directive 9, authorized under the full authority of the Human Planetary Council, and that the operation would proceed in sequence beginning with the 3 orbital processing stations and concluding with Kethavar Prime. She did not offer a compliance window. There was no compliance window in Directive 9. The directive had been written after the Caspan Basin. The people who wrote it had understood what kind of answer the Convergence's communique had actually been asking for, and they had written an answer accordingly. The array sequence ran for 4 hours and 17 minutes. I watched it from the forward observation bay, which was glass, and gave me a clean line of sight to the primary target package. The orbital processing stations collapsed inward on the Caspan frequency the way the basin had, not explosively, but with that same folding inward, the substrate of their docking arms and hull superstructure, losing coherence, and then continuity. The shipyard complexes went in the second sequence, the administrative hubs in the third. Kethavar Prime took 38 minutes. I did not file a story. I had been a correspondent for 20 years. I had covered resource disputes and border actions, and 2 separate Galactic Council tribunals, where the language was very precise, and the consequences were very small. I had always filed. That morning I sat in the observation bay and watched, and did not reach for my recorder, and could not have explained, if asked, whether what I felt was justice or its absence, or whether those 2 things had, sometime in the past 17 years, simply become the same thing. When the sequence was complete, Admiral Solis opened the fleet-wide channel. She said, the Caspan Basin was not a calibration. She said nothing else. She did not need to. The returned measure turned on a heading back toward the inner systems, and the fleet held formation, and the stars ahead were exactly as they had always been, cold and indifferent, and utterly unconcerned with what any of us had done or had become. I thought about the drilling engineer. I had never learned his name. He had been standing 2 meters to my left, explaining survey data, and the ground had folded, and I had run east, and he had not run anywhere. I thought about that. I thought about the pediatric trauma ward and its humanitarian commendation, and whether the ward administrator had been in the building that morning or somewhere else. Then I closed my log and went below. The Convergence had needed to know what we were capable of. Now they did not need to know anything at all.